The outbreak of SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, is a chilling reminder of our frailty in the face of Mother Nature. SARS has already infected around 5,000 people worldwide. It's killed 300 so far. This is the inside story of an epidemic that's brought the world to the edge of panic. SARS has spread with alarming speed. Canada is in the front line of the fight against the disease. Toronto has been badly hit. This is known as the War Room in Canada's Ministry of Health. Here, medical officials, scientists and politicians are striving to win Toronto's battle against the SARS epidemic. In this command centre, they track the spread of the new disease, imposing quarantines and monitoring the global situation.
It's not following any of the rules of infectious diseases. It's highly contagious.
Around the world, thousands are fighting for their lives. Those who catch it have a 1 in 16 chance of dying.
I was scared to death. I thought I was going to die.
This is a powerful virus. It's not just killing the old and the weak.
It is quite clear that it is a unique and novel virus. It's a virus that is new to science.
Tracking down this silent killer is a detective story of global proportions. Scientists now believe they're able to pinpoint the origin of the outbreak to rural China, where it may have originated from animals. This program follows the story of how the mystery SARS virus emerged without warning. It's an international tale of how one man, a super spreader, first transmitted it, and how scientists have been tracking the disease round the world. The question now is, where will the disease go next? From Beijing to Singapore, Toronto to London, cities across the world are screening travellers and gearing up to impose strict quarantine conditions. But the story starts here in Hong Kong, the original epicentre of the SARS explosion. This is where the world was first alerted to the threat of the virus at the end of March. It's now a city on the edge of panic. 1,500 people in Hong Kong have been struck down. Over 130 have died. Locals fear the whole city is infected. They hope masks will prevent any particles carrying the virus from entering their nose or mouth. It could be only a matter of time before we see the same thing in New York, Paris or London. But Hong Kong's rumour mill is in overdrive. People fear SARS may not only be spread by coughing and sneezing, but also by direct contact. So no one shakes hands anymore. Business cards are no longer exchanged. People no longer use public phones. They shun communal machines. Public handrails are not there to be touched. A single cough on the tube sends out a ripple of fear. Some experts predict social meltdown.
It just came off out of the blue. It was off of everybody's radar screen. In February, we're all talking about what's going to be the impact on the Iraq war, on tourism, on oil prices, on the stock market. SARS hit. All of a sudden, we're not only seeing nobody on the airplanes, we're not only seeing nobody in our stores, but we're wondering what's going to happen to my child, what's going to happen to my family.
From spreading, please cover your nose and mouth when sneezing or coughing. Wash hands with liquid soap regularly. And wear masks if you have respiratory tract infection.
To help prevent the further spread of SARS, it was essential to work out how the disease first arrived in Hong Kong. medical investigators have traced the source back to one person. On February the 21st this year, Professor Liu Jianlun, a medical consultant, checked into the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong. Liu had come from the mainland China province of Guangdong and was visiting Hong Kong for a wedding. But Professor Liu was ill with a serious chest problem. Hotel staff remember him coughing and sneezing as he checked in. Then he took the lift to the 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel. On the way up, Liu encountered a Chinese-American businessman named Johnny Cheng. Cheng also had a room on the 9th floor of the hotel. Professor Liu had arrived in Hong Kong, one of the most densely populated parts of the world, when he was at his most contagious. Liu knew he was desperately ill. 2 days later, he checked himself into this hospital, the Kwong Wah, in Hong Kong. At first, doctors there thought his chest condition was yet another case of influenza. But as Liu lay dying, gasping for air, he revealed that he'd been secretly trying to contain a deadly outbreak of a new kind of pneumonia in southern China. This was the killer virus that would soon become known as SARS. Referred to as Patient Zero, Professor Liu had already triggered an epidemic. As the doctors listened to his confession, little did they realize that more than 70 health workers would become infected. Within days, Professor Liu was dead. At first, the symptoms of SARS are unremarkable. Shortness of breath, coughing, and then high temperature, much like catching flu. But the symptoms don't stop there. Within a few days, the patient develops full-scale pneumonia. They struggle to get air into their lungs. With no cure for the disease and no drugs to help, the patient gasps for breath. Without oxygen treatment and a robust immune system, the sufferer's chances of survival decrease. All this time, the patient's lungs are slowly filling with water. Pushing oxygen into the lungs by a ventilator becomes the last resort. SARS spreads fast. Less than 1 month after Professor Liu died, there was a disastrous outbreak in Hong Kong that spread panic. In just a few days, 200 SARS cases were reported from a single residential block. Amoy Gardens is 33 stories high. Here there seemed definitive proof that SARS could be spread from person to person without them ever meeting, and with alarming speed. Resident Anna Yuen watched the outbreak spread through Amoy Gardens.
The first day, I got 4 cases. But the next day, then is 20, and then next day is 30, and the next day is 40. At that time, I'm afraid.
14 would die. Scientists began to believe that the SARS virus could also be passed by contact with communal surfaces, like lift buttons and door handles.
As I read from the news, maybe from the touching, maybe when we breathe, they go out, and we touch the surface of the lift. Now it's over 200 in this block. Maybe from the touching.
Scientists were baffled. Most infectious diseases move horizontally along corridors from neighbour to neighbour, but the SARS virus was moving vertically up the building. With the exact method of transmission still unclear, the Hong Kong government declared an emergency. In a massive quarantining operation, they evacuated all residents from the infected block at Amoy Gardens and isolated them in a disused holiday camp. What followed was a full-scale emergency as Hong Kong officials moved in to disinfect the block. Hong Kong has always operated special teams to combat new forms of influenza sweeping in from China. In the front line of that battle is this laboratory. And leading the fight is world expert Professor Malik Pieris. Early in March, Professor Pieris began examining tissue taken from patients who had the mysterious new form of pneumonia.
One Monday morning, when together with my colleague, we were looking at these cells that had been inoculated, in this case with the lung biopsy of one of these patients who was having a very severe pneumonia, we saw something very strange. One of the things we did was to look at it under the electron microscope, and we could see that these cells were teeming with what seemed to be hundreds of virus particles inside them and on their surface. What we saw was that the cells were dying.
SARS was literally eating through the patient's lungs. This was no ordinary virus. In their battle to fight the spread of SARS, investigators have had to piece together the movements of the Chinese professor who first carried the virus to Hong Kong. They discovered he'd come from Guangdong province over the border in South China that day. At the provincial capital of Guangzhou, formerly Canton, Professor Liu worked as a consultant at one of the city's hospitals. During November last year, 5 patients had died here from a mystery illness. The Chinese authorities had no indication of what it was, but new patients were developing full-scale pneumonia. Throughout December 2002 and January of this year, the outbreak gathered pace, but it was kept secret from the rest of the world. Professor Liu and the Chinese medical authorities had discovered an alarming trend. Many of his patients were peasants who worked with birds. Like millions of others in southern China, they would have been in close contact with ducks and chickens and other animals on their farms. And in the towns and cities of southern China, chickens and other livestock are often kept next to open sewers. Professor Liu's first patient, a peasant farmer, had also visited a market near the town of Foshan. This place is a virologist's nightmare. Racks of birds sit on top of caged dogs. Fowl are boiled and sold with their feathers as part of the staple diet. Humans here are in close contact with all manner of live and dead animals and the viruses they carry. But SARS isn't the first killer bug to come out of southern China, a hotbed of unaccountable diseases. Professor Peter Curzon has studied the origin and spread of new diseases.
It's been well known for quite some time that South China has functioned as an incubation chamber for a whole range of interesting respiratory infections, and that's probably been the case for maybe even thousands of years.
Professor John Oxford, an expert on respiratory diseases like influenza, also points to southern China as a breeding ground.
South China seems to be the origin of lots of these infections, and indeed has been the origin of huge outbreaks of influenza in the past. And with influenza, we think it's a juxtaposition of several factors. First of all, a huge proportion of the world is living in an area of overcrowded conditions, and they are living in fairly close association with pigs, chickens, geese, and ducks. And so with influenza, and possibly with SARS, they're in contact with the virus in these animals and birds.
I remember recently reading that an account of farming in South China where pigs are also being fed regularly from offshoots of local restaurants, and the wastes of the battery hens were also feeding into the pigs' troughs. You can understand how it's possible for the intermingling and genetic exchange of viruses and bacteria in such situations.
The disease that Professor Liu was treating in secret was a new form of pneumonia, possibly caused by a virus jumping species from a bird or animal. Early on February the 21st, Professor Liu prepared to cross into Hong Kong to go to a wedding. At the hospital where he worked in Guangzhou, he'd made an important breakthrough. He discovered that the antibodies that fought the SARS virus didn't show up in normal, healthy humans. The antibodies only appeared in patients fighting SARS. The virus was therefore new to humans and could only have come from animals. When Liu bought his bus ticket for Hong Kong, he knew there were hundreds of patients being treated in southern China for the new disease, and that this information was a Chinese state secret. Worse still, the infection was spreading with frightening speed among Liu's own hospital staff. As he boarded the bus with his wedding present, Professor Liu carried another secret. He was ill. Whether he knew he was carrying the SARS virus is a mystery. Liu had a dry cough, the first symptom of SARS. Because he was to infect hundreds of people, medical investigators would later refer to him as a super spreader of the new virus. On the bus journey towards Hong Kong, he developed a fever. Patient Zero was about to take the SARS virus out of mainland China. But the killer virus didn't stop in the Hong Kong hospital where Professor Liu died. A few days later, Johnny Cheng, a Chinese-American businessman, would also go down with the disease. He had travelled in the lift to the 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel alongside Professor Liu while he was coughing. On the 23rd of February, Johnny Cheng bought a ticket at Hong Kong Airport to fly to Vietnam on a business trip. Cheng had become patient 01. He'd become the next super spreader. He landed at Hanoi's airport in Vietnam and headed for the city. Johnny Cheng had brought the SARS virus to Vietnam. Professor Eileen Plant, who runs the WHO office in Hanoi, takes up the story.
Well, the biggest risk for Vietnam is that somebody will come into the country not knowing they've got SARS. Visiting Chinese-American businessman arrived from Hong Kong, and he was ill and eventually was admitted to the Hanoi French Hospital on the 26th of February.
That evening in Hanoi, 5 days after he'd met Professor Liu in Hong Kong, Johnny Cheng developed a fever. Cheng admitted himself to a hospital in the city. He was treated by Carlo Urbani, an Italian doctor based in Hanoi. Dr. Urbani was the first person to describe the symptoms of SARS. but treating infected patients like Johnny Cheng cost him his life.
Carlo Urbani was the first person to recognise this disease. He gave the world the first description of SARS. He actually described that people came in and they'd had a fever and they had headaches and aches and pains, and then they got a dry cough. And then some of them got worse and went on to what we now know as a respiratory distress syndrome. I suppose in the end, Carlo didn't know it was a new virus, but he certainly knew it was something he'd never seen or come across before. What Carlo Urbani did was real bravery. I mean, he knew there was something unusual, and he went in every day, never resorting to the telephone. To me, to do that every day when you're watching people getting sicker and sicker and some of them dying, that's true courage. This was a scientist who just kept hanging in there every day, doing what he had to do, and of course, in the end, at the cost of his own life.
Carlo Urbani, 4 of his staff, and the super spreader of the disease, Johnny Cheng, all died in the SARS outbreak in Hanoi, but not before they'd infected 63 others in the hospital. X-rays of the lungs of SARS victims from the Vietnam outbreak were alarming. In comparison to dark, healthy ones like this, the lungs of a SARS patient show up white, full of fluid.
This person must have died. I don't know who they were, but they must have died.
Investigators are confused as to why some people with the virus, the so-called super spreaders of SARS, are dramatically more contagious than others who have the disease.
Super spreaders are names for the people who seem to give infection to lots and lots of people. Now, what we don't know is if what actually happens is some people get very ill and have lots of virus in their body tissue. So every time they cough or maybe have diarrhoea or vomiting, we don't really know, they tend to spread disease to other people.
Back in Hong Kong at the beginning of March, SARS began to spread in the city. It came from other guests who'd stayed on the 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel and had now contracted the disease. They went on to infect 70 staff at the Prince of Wales Hospital. Hong Kong panicked. If medical staff aren't safe, then the hospitals themselves are not safe.
The risk for me going home to my family is too great for them to be to stay in Hong Kong. But all the employees involved, all the healthcare workers involved in this, have to take precautions when they go home. They sleep in separate rooms. They eat separately. They wear a mask at home. This is not a pleasant way to live your life.
Next, the disease was spread by medical staff from the Prince of Wales Hospital to the Pamela Youde Hospital, also in Hong Kong, where Kwok Chi Hung is a nursing assistant.
On March 13th, we had a few colleagues who showed symptoms of SARS, and we had to come back to have X-rays and blood tests. After my X-ray, it was suspected I had pneumonia, and I was admitted into hospital. 7 medical workers were infected in our ward.
With the situation now deteriorating rapidly, the World Health Organization in Geneva stepped in. In an unprecedented move, leading scientists and laboratories were mobilized in 10 countries around the world.
Let's start with, I know in Vietnam, Aileen.
Hello, this is Aileen and Pascal in Hanoi. How are you today?
From Hong Kong. Hello.
Good morning, Klaus. This is night time for us in Hong Kong.
It was a scientific challenge of global proportions. The problem was to find the virus causing SARS and then identify it. It was a race against time. In the Hong Kong laboratory in early April, scientists made a key breakthrough. This tiny slice of lung tissue came from a patient infected with SARS. When John Nichols, a pathologist in the laboratory, used an electron microscope to examine the tissue, he discovered the exact type of virus causing SARS.
There's a little fluid-filled cavity present here in the center, which contains lots of these small viral particles. They're also here on the surface of the cell.
But when these virus particles were magnified 100,000 times, he was surprised to find the virus had spikes.
The spikes which are present on the virus make it part of the coronavirus family. Now, this was unexpected because the normal coronavirus, as the virologists will tell you, normally only causes the common cold in humans. So finding this virus, which is causing such severe problems in these patients, was a concern. This is how the coronavirus looks. It comes from the Latin corona, which means crown, because if you think about the old English-style crowns which had the spikes on them.
We also knew when we tested blood samples of healthy people that none of them had any antibodies prior exposure to this virus in the past. So we knew that this was not a virus that had been circulating in humans before. We knew genetically that it was something very unusual. And therefore, the most likely conclusion was that this was an animal virus that had jumped across to humans.
What has happened, I think, is that we now have a mutant virus which has now found a host to which there is no immunity, which has not been exposed before, and so it has basically free range. It can replicate and it can pass from one person to another. So it is now proving to be very, very effective.
Now the laboratory has isolated the virus, the long-term task will be to find the carrier animal and then produce a vaccine for the public. But the most urgent need was to find out how the SARS virus was spread. It was believed that Professor Liu had passed the disease by spraying droplets in the air when coughing. But when the 200 cases of SARS appeared almost overnight in the block of flats at Amoy Gardens, it emerged there might be another way of catching the disease. The residents were removed and put in quarantine while the whole block was disinfected. At first, scientists wondered if the SARS virus had spread in the block through contact with lift buttons. Once Amoy Gardens had been disinfected, the residents returned after a week in isolation. Anna Yuen felt safe.
Yes, a great improvement. People make attention to the personal hygiene now. I think it's a little bit under control.
But scientists did make an important discovery at Amoy Gardens. Running up the side of the building are sewage pipes. Old and rusty, they reappear in the tiny kitchens of each flat. These rusty pipes leak. Scientists now knew that the SARS virus could also be carried in human sewage. They discovered the Amoy Gardens outbreak had been triggered by a single super spreader. The carrier was a man with kidney failure who'd been discharged from the SARS-infected Prince of Wales Hospital. He'd visited his brother in Amoy Gardens and used the toilet there.
Now we know that in addition to the respiratory tract, the virus is also shed in the feces. And that now opens up a new potential route of transmission. For example, things like sewage might also contribute to transmission of this virus.
The SARS virus was much more resilient than scientists had first thought. It could be carried in different parts of the body. With the Amoy Gardens outbreak, the scientists' worst fears were confirmed. Now, it was only a matter of time before SARS would move to North America and Europe. Modern air travel has enabled SARS to spread around the world at frightening speed. Before the SARS outbreak in Hong Kong became apparent, travellers were coming and going as normal. Another guest who stayed on the same infamous 9th floor as Professor Liu and Johnny Cheng was Mrs. Sui Chu Kwan. She checked out of the Metropole Hotel and headed for the airport to fly back home to Canada. She was another of the super spreaders. In one fateful trip, she would take the deadly virus to the other side of the world. At Toronto Airport, she met and embraced her son. As it turned out, it was a deadly embrace. Her health rapidly deteriorated, and she died 10 days after arriving in Canada. Her son was admitted to Scarborough Grace Hospital and died a week later.
SARS is, as far as we know, transmitted by close personal contact. So all of the cases that we have resulted in Toronto resulted from that one importation from Hong Kong, or the woman who stayed in the Metropole Hotel, who infected her family, who in turn infected healthcare workers and other patients, and there's been spread from that.
Before the world's medical authorities could realize what was going on, the disease was spreading fast. Patients contaminated with SARS were transferred to other Toronto hospitals, including Mount Sinai.
We had to close our intensive care unit and our emergency department because we had a case of SARS in our intensive care unit that was unrecognized, and we were concerned about exposure. We closed it. We put 80 people on quarantine, and within 4 days, we admitted 5 healthcare workers into the hospital with disease. That shows you how infectious this is.
One of those healthcare workers was nurse Susan Sorrenti.
I was one of the first nurses to take care of the first SARS patients in Toronto. I admitted the patient on the Sunday evening. I was supposed to report into work on Wednesday. They called me at that point and said, "We're very sorry to tell you that you have been in contact with a SARS patient. You are now under quarantine."
In less than a week after her contact with a SARS patient, Susan started to develop symptoms.
I was put under isolation almost immediately upon entering the hospital. I was devastated that my family were now under quarantine. And that meant that for 10 days, I did not know if my family were going to be okay.
Psychologically, it is not only incredibly difficult for patients to be in isolation, especially patients that are sick, having to be in isolation, not being able to see family members, but you know, it's more importantly, it's psychologically very difficult on the healthcare workers.
You had initially a fever, and then the fever for me developed into chills. And I had a temperature as high as 39.7, which is quite dangerously febrile. I became quite scared.
This is a nasty new infection due to a very mean virus that we've never seen before. It's not following any of the rules of infectious diseases.
The analgesics and the antipyretics they were giving me were not working. And added to that was anxiety, which made it even worse. The antiviral they were giving me made me incredibly nauseated. So I also had nausea, vomiting, other gastric symptoms, which are quite unpleasant. I was scared to death. I thought I was going to die.
This has put stress on people that they've never experienced before, having to deal with the unknown. And so it's a new world.
To cope with this new world, the public health authorities in Canada's capital, Ottawa, swung into action. This is the Emergency Operations Centre. Daily teleconferences are held with experts around Canada.
Good morning, it's Ron St. John here.
One of them is Dr. Frank Plummer in Winnipeg.
Yeah, I guess my point was there will be a lot of nervous people there wanting to ask questions.
As a suspected SARS case arrives by plane from Paris, he advises them on quarantine protocol.
I think having one quarantine officer there probably won't be able to do it if it's a full 747. So I'm not sure whose job it is, but I think we need to think about that.
Once we heard from the WHO that they'd issued a global health emergency, we issued a travel advisory Secondly, then we started assisting the provinces and territories in terms of investigation.
We immediately went to work trying to collect the data on the epidemiology of the disease, how widespread was the disease, how many people have the disease.
So that we can continue to modify the actions accordingly.
It had taken just 2 days for the deadly virus to travel from here in South China to Canada. From one small area in the Guangdong province, SARS had spread across the world and was now on the rampage. The Canadian government is taking no chances in getting the message across about the containment of SARS. So far, their tough action has prevented it spreading across the country. Daily press conferences keep the media and the public abreast of safety guidelines, home quarantine rules, and how to protect yourself against this deadly disease. With over 20 deaths so far, Toronto is in the spotlight.
We want to keep our messages very simple today because we're still concerned that we are at a very, very critical time. If you are in isolation, you stay in isolation. And isolation is for 10 days. It means wearing a mask when you're around people. If people are having any of the symptoms shown on the poster to the side here, they should not be out in the community. They should not be going to work. They should not be going to church. They should not be going to family and friends over this weekend.
With respect to quarantine issues, there are long-standing public health laws in Canada for imposing a quarantine. Quarantine should be understood to be a mandatory enforced isolation of a person, usually in their home, so that a disease can't spread.
The Canadian police have the power to detain travellers from abroad whom they believe may be carrying SARS, and to impose home quarantine on their own citizens.
We've had a few people in Toronto that, whatever reason, did not abide by the request that they self-isolate themselves, and then measures were taken under the Ontario law. The usual measures under the Ontario law and/or the federal law is to serve that person with a document that says you must be detained, and to back that up with police enforcement if required.
Controversially, on April the 23rd, the WHO issued the advice that no one should travel to Toronto. Could the same be about to happen to other Western cities? The nature of SARS is still not fully understood. So even though Susan Sorrenti has recovered, she has to wear a mask and stay in home quarantine for 1 more week. The trauma of being separated from her family while she was dangerously ill was hard to bear.
As far as communicating with my family by telephone, well, that was my only way of communicating with them. I couldn't see them. I was completely isolated from my family. And it was a lifeline for me. If I couldn't have talked to my family, I probably would have just perished from just the devastation of being in the isolation. How I felt leaving that hospital. It was a beautiful sunny day. Breathing fresh air. I was outside. I saw my husband and I broke down in tears. It felt so good to be out of there.
But while the Canadians are managing to contain this deadly killer, the rest of the world is wondering where it will strike next. In China, where the SARS virus first surfaced, an epidemic is now raging out of control. Since the initial outbreak in November last year, the number of cases had been kept an official state secret, known only to top officials. Now a Chinese whistleblower has alerted the world to the hidden disaster. A military doctor revealed that the number of SARS cases in state hospitals was being covered up. He timed his leak to coincide with a WHO fact-finding visit to China.
The problem is that the military hospitals do not report. And I think that's an issue that very clearly has now been advised by WHO that needs to be changed. The good news is that the government themselves are discussing this very clearly.
SARS and secrecy don't go together. Now the Chinese government have been forced to reveal they have 10 times more cases than previously admitted.
We have very clearly said from, look here, you have an international community over here who does at this very moment do not trust your figures.
With around 3,000 cases and over 1,000 in Beijing alone, China stands revealed as the worst hit country.
I think it would have helped if the Chinese authorities had been a little more open about problems in the southern part of the country. You know, an early warning, surveillance, early warning is a key to this sort of thing.
It is possible there may be thousands of cases that haven't been disclosed in China, and if that's the case, then the epicenter of the epidemic is China, and that's where the real epidemic is. And all we're seeing are the offshoots of people who've actually had the misfortune to come into contact with somebody and have then flown around the world. SARS is probably a very long-established infection that may have been circulating quite naturally among wildlife or small animals in southern China. I suspect SARS has been around for a long time. It's quite possible that some form of respiratory disease resembling SARS has been around, but a change in the sort of agricultural activity has perhaps nurtured and allowed the emergence of a slight variant, a much more virulent variant, that can probably spread to human populations much easier than some of the past infections have done. And with the more intensive farming, battery chickens, ducks close by, and also in this case pigs, there's certainly been a tremendous amount of intermingling of respiratory viruses.
Historically, this is the way repeated new epidemics of another respiratory disease, influenza, have appeared in South China. When pigs, chickens and ducks exist close to people living in high density, there are plenty of targets for new mutant flu viruses emerging from these carrier animals. The same is probably true of the SARS virus. These new viruses swap back and forth between the different animals to humans, mutating with devastating effect. Once our immune system kills off one new strain, another more devastating virus emerges, to which there is no defense. It's believed some form of the SARS virus may have been around for hundreds of years in one of these different mutant strains.
There are a number of different ways in which you can catch a virus from an animal. One is if you're slaughtering the animal, you infect yourself that way by a small cut. You can have food that's contaminated with animal feces. You can have respiratory spread. There are many different ways.
SARS is not the first new lethal infection to originate from animals.
The most recent examples of viruses crossing species, huge examples, would be HIV and hepatitis B, both of which we think came from primates, from apes, from chimpanzees, and came across that species barrier.
In the 70s and the 80s, the world was faced by the emergence of a whole range of interesting exotic new, so-called new infections like Ebola, Lassa fever, Legionnaire's disease, Marburg's disease, the resurgence of Lyme disease and the like. And suddenly the game changed in some ways. Suddenly people now began to talk about no longer the decline of infectious disease, but the re-emergence of infectious disease and the emergence of so-called new infections.
In Hong Kong and other Asian cities, SARS has had another effect that has nothing to do with the medical epidemic.
We're seeing not one epidemic here, but two. There's one epidemic that involves cases and deaths in a restricted time frame. The other epidemic is an epidemic of reaction, fear, panic, hysteria and paranoia, which far threatens to overwhelm the other epidemic. The extent of fear and the extent of panic, the extent of people fleeing from the epidemic,
a good 80% of the people on the street are wearing face masks now. Considering that you really only have to wear them if you're ill to prevent it from spreading, I'm assuming that 80% of the people aren't ill. So a large portion are just doing it because they're afraid. You look at a person driving a car with their windows up. They're wearing a mask. I guess they're afraid of catching it from the radio.
As each new victim contracts the disease, it's reported on the nightly news. SARS has become the first new disease to be tracked in real time round the world, heightening the economic panic.
All of a sudden, SARS hit. There's not one company in Hong Kong that isn't affected. The problem is even worse because most companies in Hong Kong are small and medium-sized enterprises. I think in the next month or two, you're going to have an unprecedented flood of bankruptcies. There's no one in the restaurants. It's wherever you go. From the time when you arrive in Hong Kong on an airplane and you find that it's empty now, whereas a month ago, you couldn't get a seat. You go into a hotel, you have 7%, 8%, 9% occupancy from a place that's used to 90% occupancy. There's 7 million people in Hong Kong. Of the 7 million people now, we have fewer than 2,000 people who have caught it. So the percentages of getting it are very small, but that doesn't stop people from being afraid about it. I think that the real damage has to do with the panic, the economy. That's affecting everybody.
Doctors and scientists are trying to dampen down the panic that's been generated. They point to the low contagious nature of SARS compared to other diseases and to the relatively low death rate of 6%.
If you look at the number of deaths associated with pneumonia in Hong Kong this last month, compared to the number of deaths associated with pneumonia last year, the same month, it's a bit higher, but it's not 5-fold or 10-fold or 20-fold higher. So I think you have to keep things in proportion. I mean, if it is going to remain with us, it will be another cause of pneumonia. That's bad news, but it's not the end of the world.
Influenza is highly contagious. You know, the outbreaks are normally explosive. You just pick it up by sitting next to someone. You know, it's explosive, explosive, explosive. Compared to that, the virus causing the present SARS outbreak, as we see it at the moment, looks much, much less infectious. And I'm saying that because many of the cases, if not most of the cases, have been restricted to people in families, you know, where you're in very close contact with each other. Cases in hospitals, again, where people are in very close contact with each other, and in hotels. And that's the classic signal that a virus of fairly low infectiousness gives, that it can spread under particular circumstances, but does not have the beef, the oomph, to explode out into the great wider community.
But scientists and doctors also know that it could be more than a year before there is a vaccine. Until then, the only way to stop the spread is rapid diagnosis followed by quarantine.
I think SARS is just one example of emerging infections, and I believe there will be more. I believe that the next 10 years or so will see a substantial period of infectious disease in the world. Partly this is due to the globalization and the interconnectedness of the world. It's also due to the fact that we continue to modify the environment and we continue to intrude on natural disease systems. I believe that we will see a lot more new, in inverted commas, infections over the next 10 years or so.
China, the world's largest country, is struggling to contain the SARS outbreak. If a super spreader like Professor Liu arrived in Britain, would our nation be able to contain SARS?